I don't know the extent of Russian influence within the election. It does seem, as things stand, compelling evidence that there was Russian interference through hacking, which was then obviously disseminated via WikiLeaks. Is that why I think Donald Trump won in the Electoral College? Because obviously he lost by quite a significant margin the popular vote. No, I think it's one factor amongst many. I think, a Democratic candidate who was seen as very much part of the establishment. And I think it's easy to let the Democrat campaign off the hook and just say, it was the Russians who did it. And I don't think that's true. I think the Russians, I don't think the Rust Belt of the United States didn't come out and, endorse Hillary Clinton by majority isn't because of Vladimir Putin. I think it is a factor amongst many that has to be analysed, but I do think you have to put it in the broader context of repeated American subversion and interference in foreign elections, including in Russia in the 1990s. I mean, they interfered overtly in the 1996 presidential election in Russia. But also, they've repeatedly helped overthrow democratically elected governments. My own parents brought in refugees from Chile who fled, the Allende regime. Her husband had been murdered, she'd been raped, and she ended up taking her own life. And she fled a country where a democratic government was overthrown with the support of the United States, whose, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said, we will not stand by and allow a country to go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people. You've had that across Latin America, across Central America, across Africa, Asian countries as well. So, the US, you do need to take seriously, obviously, attempts by Putin and Russia, a regime which is an unacceptable authoritarian regime, which, the populist right of the West look to for inspiration. They do. The National Front in France, UKIP here, the Italian Northern League, and obviously Donald Trump himself. They all look to Vladimir Putin. He's a protege, a mentor, an inspiration to all of them. And I do think clearly he wanted Donald Trump to win, and I think they intervened to help in some way. But I don't think that's why Hillary Clinton lost the Electoral College. And also, I do think we need to put it in a broader context, which is the US is more than happy to interfere. And, in terms of America, why did Donald Trump win? Well, I think it's there's sometimes a temptation that it has to be one thing or the other, and I don't agree with that. I think, obviously, racism played a role. There was a backlash amongst a certain group of people at the rise and the gains of the civil rights movement, the anti-racism movements, feminism, the LGBT movements, and clearly there was an element of backlash there. And the other, of course, was economic insecurity, stagnating and declining living standards, the disappearance of secure, skilled jobs in many parts of the United States. And I think Donald Trump latched onto that very effectively, whilst Hillary Clinton was seen as being part of the political model that was responsible for many of those problems. So, it's not one thing or the other. I think lots of factors were at play. Life is generally quite complicated, and we don't always have to reduce it to one thing.
Talking about Brexit, what's your view on Jeremy Corbyn not having wholeheartedly supported the Remain campaign?
There's lots of criticisms which I myself have made of Jeremy Corbyn. I think the problem with the EU referendum is this. Look, Labour voters overwhelmingly, a large majority of Labour voters voted for Remain. It's between 2/3 and 3/4. In fact, a similar proportion of Labour voters voted for Remain as SNP voters. Scottish National Party voters voted for Remain. But no one's saying that the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, didn't campaign with enough gusto. The problem with what Labour could have done is done this full-throated, stand with David Cameron and all the rest. But we'd had the experience of Scotland where you had an independence referendum there, which destroyed the Scottish Labour Party because they stood in alliance with the Scottish Tories and the establishment to say, in a campaign of fear, to say your life, everything will collapse, your jobs will disappear, all the rest. And it caused fury and anger, and anger's still there. And, most people, a lot of people of Labour voters were out where Jeremy Corbyn was out, which is to go, look, we don't think the EU is like this amazing, incredible thing, but on balance we should stay in it, and this is why. And that's what he said. And I think the reason the campaign was lost was not above all because of that. Look, the Leave campaign had this great slogan, take back control. And that resonated with people. People who felt they have no control over their lives, their communities, that, their living standards have fallen and declined, they worried about the future of their kids. And the Remain campaign came across as a very establishment corporate entity threatening economic ruin to people who already feel their lives are defined by economic insecurity. It didn't work, and I don't think that was Jeremy Corbyn's fault above all else. The danger that Labour have is they're in a very difficult position, a uniquely difficult position, because the Labour coalition includes people who are very strongly pro-Remain and very strongly pro-Leave, and the Tories don't have the same problem. You have Tory voters who voted Remain, but they're not like generally fervent Remain supporters. They will shrug their shoulders and go, well, I wanted to stay in the European Union, c'est la vie. The difference is with the Labour, you get lots of working class Labour voters, particularly older working class voters in northern areas of England, like Doncaster, Sunderland, who are very strongly anti-EU and obviously very opposed to immigration. And then you get people like where we're sitting here in the middle of London. This borough, Islington, nearly 8 out of 10 people voted to Remain, and this is a Labour constituency. So you get, you've got to straddle a very difficult divide between people who, on the one hand, feel very angry, very upset, very traumatised by Brexit. They feel it's a nightmare that just won't end. And then you've got people who are fervently and continue to be fervently support leaving, and they both support Labour. So Labour has to come up with a strategy that can keep them both together, and that is not easy at all.
And there's always the danger of these people defecting to UKIP.
Well, the dangers with Labour is coalitions. You get the Remainers, they could end up being disillusioned and defecting to the Liberal Democrats or the Greens if they think Labour's too pro-Brexit. And then on the other hand, you've got Labour voters who will defect to UKIP, for example, or maybe the Conservative Party, but mostly not. UKIP are waiting. They're circling around Labour's coalition, particularly in the north, and they've made it their strategic aim to try and win over working class northern voters.
So that's all said and done. Are we headed towards a train crash Brexit?
Well, I don't want to make predictions, but obviously it looks bad. I mean, Brexit has had a terrible impact on the political culture of this country. It's a British variant of authoritarian right-wing populism. And the one thing in common with Donald Trump and the right-wing Brexiteers is they're both what you could call sore winners. They both act like they've lost, and they continue to attack their opposition as though the opposition won. So in this country, you get these bitter, venomous attack on Remainers, or Ramonas as they're called. But we lost the referendum. We didn't win. We're not in charge of this situation. And I think the danger is, I think the danger is of a chaotic, harsh Brexit, which is very damaging to the jobs, living standards and the economy of the country. And they will try and blame Remainers for sabotaging it, but we're not running this. The people responsible now are the Brexiteers. Obviously, we've got to make the best of it, and I support, getting the best possible deal we can.
And if you don't get that good deal, because the chances are right now that the deal is going to be pretty painful.
Well, it's not in the interest of the European Union to give Britain a good deal, because they've all got to agree, all the member states, and if you've got a precedent of a major EU country leaving the EU, that's bad. Sets a precedent. They don't want to encourage that, and also they all have anti-EU, anti-immigrant parties of their own to deal with. They're worried about them being bolstered. Many of their voters already resent Britain because they think Britain had a special treatment already from the European Union. So obviously that makes it very difficult. That's why, as things stand, we've got to campaign for a good Brexit. We can't. There was something to say, well, let's campaign for a second referendum. The problem with that is, under the nature of the British electoral system, if you rerun the referendum under our electoral system in a general election, Leave would win 421 seats and Remain would win 229 seats. And the reason for that is we have first past the post, we don't have a proportional system. And in a constituency like this, Remain got a massive... So in the big cities and Scotland, Remain got these massive, huge margins. But in most of the country, Leave won most of the constituencies. So people who argue to overturn it, and also a lot of the Remain voters, according to the polling, say we just have to accept the outcome of the referendum. So anyone who calls for that, they'll be argued, will be trying to undermine the democratic verdict of the British people. if Remain had won 52 against 48, and Nigel Farage and the rest demanded a second referendum, we would have been the first to say that's undemocratic, you lost, get over it.
Yeah.
So we just have to, it's hard, it's bitterly hard, it's difficult, but we've got to accept it. And we've just got to fight for the best possible deal we can. Obviously, Syriza was a very bitter experience for all of us on the left. I was in Greece, in Athens, for the election in January 2015, which feels frankly like a lifetime away now. And obviously, the whole point of what happened with Greece was to make an example of the Greek government. And Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, said that the fear wasn't an economic contagion or financial contagion, it was political contagion. Because if the Greek government was seen to be successful, then that would encourage other left forces like Podemos in Spain as well. And the difference is, look, Greece is a beautiful, great country, but it's also a tiny proportion of the Eurozone. It's 2% of the economy. So they actually took a big political hit, the EU. I mean, they were damaged by it, but they could still manage to get away with it because Greece was dispensable. It was 2% of the economy. They could afford to threaten it in the way they did. If that was the Spanish government, they just couldn't have done the same thing at all. So I think that is worth bearing in mind. You know, yes, Greece was a terrible defeat, a very bitter defeat, but, you know, these things aren't easy. It's called a struggle for a reason, not a walkover. And I just do not believe that the future belongs to the Nigel Farages and the Donald Trumps and the Marine Le Pens. I just don't believe that. History will damn those who scapegoated immigrants and poor people for all the problems in society. And I think those who fought against those people will be looked upon far more kindly. And history isn't this constant, you know... Unfortunately, it's not a constant story of progress, of victories and successes, but often terrible setbacks and defeats. And in the 1930s, things were far worse than they are today. We were overwhelmed by genocidal, totalitarian fascism. It's always worth bearing that in mind. And I think, you know, the left was being physically exterminated across Europe. And that isn't the case today. Things are very difficult and very hard. And what the left has to do is come up with a coherent, inspiring alternative that is told in a language that people understand, and we've often failed to do that. But I do look at, you know, Bernie Sanders. He didn't win the nomination, but look how far he came. I mean, you know, I don't think, you know, I think that the old establishment wing of the Democrats has been discredited. Look at Podemos, a party which was, you know, in 2 years went from nothing to getting millions of votes in Spain. I think that's a beginning, and I think, given the anger and frustration that people have, and given how extreme the crisis that's enveloped the Western world is, we need radical solutions. The old centrism just can't answer them.
So what could these radical solutions be?
That means investment in the economy rather than the cuts that have destroyed much of the social fabric of Europe. It means promoting the industries of the future with an active state. Germany's done it with renewable energy. It means public ownership of utilities and services rather than having them run by profiteers. It's making the rich pay a proper amount of tax, which can then be used to invest in the future of the country, particularly in the young, who have suffered so badly in Greece, Spain and elsewhere. It means regulating our financial sector and having a publicly owned financial component as well, which can help promote the industries and investment of that all of our economies believe in. That all our economies depend on. You know, we need to build a society that is run on the basis of people's needs and aspirations, of people, of the social good, rather than the needs of the tiny elite that have plunged the West into a terrible, terrible disaster. And unless we do that and get our act together, then the future belongs to right-wing populists, but I don't think that's inevitable.
Do you think the best way of going about it is within a European framework or national framework?
Well, I don't think these problems can be solved one country at a time. You can't. I mean, look, we're up against what are globalised economic and political forces, and it's naive to think a country, you know, on its own steam can just solve these problems. We all, you know, the problems we face differ in specifics and scale, but they are quite similar in lots of fundamental ways. From an unregulated financial sector that's caused so much pain and hardship.
Why I'm asking, sorry to interrupt you, is because Yanis Varoufakis, with his DM movement, said he wants to democratise the EU within.
Yeah.
But you talked about like radical solutions. So I'm just wondering, do you believe that we can move forward within the current framework
I think Yanis Varoufakis is absolutely right that we need to completely transform what the European Union is and democratise it. I mean, obviously Britain won't be part of that anymore, but I do think it is a radical solution to try and transform it by making it democratic and transparent and not beholden to the interests of corporate interests, which it currently is. And that won't be easy, it will be hard, and that means that needs a pan-European movement of people to do that. You need to unite across borders, all of us do, whether we're in the European Union or not.
But within, a lot of people on the left are saying that the current framework is not adequate. So
well, look, Britain has just voted to leave the European Union. It's a disaster for our country. It's a disaster politically and all the rest, but also economically, but also politically, because, look, the xenophobic populist right is on the ascent across Europe. They're the ones who will benefit most if the European Union disintegrates. And we take it as read that the spectre of war no longer looms over our continent as it has for centuries, but I think that's naive to think otherwise. In living memory, our continent was destroyed, and it was destroyed with tens of millions of people who died. And I think if the European Union collapses, it won't suddenly mean some great new left Europe will be born out of the rubble. Of course it won't. It will mean that the plans of the Marine Le Pens, the Geert Wilders, all the rest, they're the ones who'll benefit. So no, we need to change the European Union, transform it, but that doesn't mean destroying it, because the only ones who will benefit as things stand will be the right-wing populists.